The moment Gwen Hollister's mouth twisted into a smug smile and she said those 7 words, I knew my life had changed. We don't need your foreign connections anymore. She sat in her corner office on the 42nd floor and, with 3 keystrokes, destroyed the work I had been doing for a year and a half. Something inside me broke, the same feeling of emptiness that I felt when, at 17, I found my father at the kitchen table among rejection letters and bankruptcy papers. His heart couldn't handle the stress. He lost everything because of corporations like hers. Gwen didn't even look up from her monitor as she closed one contract after another. Akitanica from Osaka, the Petrov family in Bulgaria, Miguel Santos in Mexico City. People who trusted me, built business with us, and now, probably, were preparing deliveries for which no one would pay them. Honestly, I don't even understand why Harrison hired you, Gwen continued, typing quickly, as if she were playing the piano. These connections, your relationships, my business, not a charity for other people's stories. Before I tell you what happened next, write in the comments where you're listening to this story. It's important to me to know where it goes. Subscribe, like, and hit the bell because what I say next changed everything not only for me, but for everyone who thought that strong people could ruin lives with impunity. My name is Claire, and you must understand one thing. Gwen Hollister is more than just a top manager. She built a career on other people's shattered dreams. In 23 years at Morrison Industrial, she rose from a junior analyst to vice president of global procurement, leaving a trail of broken careers in her wake. But here's what she didn't know about me. No one at Morrison knew. 15 years ago, when I had just entered university, my father worked for a small consulting firm that was acquired by Gwen's previous company. He was 58. He had worked there for 16 years, spoke 3 languages fluently, and accounted for 60% of the firm's international profits. Gwen destroyed him slowly over 6 months, not with one scandal, but with a constant poison of humiliation. She questioned his reports at meetings, took clients, and handed them to younger employees. She started rumors that he had memory problems. She made him rewrite proposals 5 or 6 times, each time changing the requirements. She turned his own team against him, implying that he was hindering the company's growth. My father, who once came to this country with nothing, who built a reputation as an honest and reliable man. My father, who had never missed work in his entire career, suddenly began to experience panic attacks right in the office parking lot. Every morning he sat in his car for 20 minutes, gathering the strength to go in and endure another day of this psychological war. That morning, when I found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by termination papers and medical bills he couldn't pay, I made a promise to myself. Someday, I will understand people like Gwen Hollister. I will learn how they think, how they justify ruining other people's lives for the sake of money and a career. I went to business school, chose international logistics, and worked for 7 years in small companies to learn everything there was to know about global procurement. Not because it was my calling, but because I was preparing myself to be the kind of person who could get close to someone like Gwen. When a position opened up at Morrison and I saw Gwen listed as the hiring manager, I knew it was an opportunity one couldn't pass up, but I also knew that simple revenge would be too weak. It had to be real, poetic. She had to feel the same helplessness my father felt in the last months of his life. I took the job and became exactly what she needed. Enthusiastic, hardworking, grateful for the opportunity. I asked just enough questions to seem engaged, but not threatening. I was ready to travel extensively, work with difficult partners abroad, and tackle challenges that even senior employees struggled with. Over the course of 18 months, I built connections Morrison had never even dreamed of, not just with suppliers, but with their families, with their stories. I learned that Kikitanaki's grandfather had been forced to sell his textile business after the war, and she was now trying to recoup what the family had lost. That the Petrov family had opened a packaging company after fleeing political persecution and mortgaged their grandmother's entire savings. That Miguel Santos had 3 daughters, all studying engineering and dreaming of taking the family business into the aerospace industry. Every time I met people who reminded me of my father, people who had dedicated their lives to building something real, something that would outlive them. But I did it. not for Morrison's benefit. I was building this for something bigger. You see, while I was traveling around the world solving the supply chain, I was also studying Gwen's career. All the companies she worked for, all the deals, all the restructurings. And I saw a pattern that made my heart clench. 15 years ago, it wasn't just my father who suffered. There was also Linda Chun, a translator who helped negotiate contracts in Taiwan. Gwen fired her 3 days before Christmas, allegedly due to layoffs, and then hired a new person for the same position with double the salary. Linda's family lost their home. There was Roberto Vega, who spent 8 years building relationships with Mexican manufacturers. Gwen fired Roberto, took credit for his work, and used his contacts to close deals that saved the company millions. Roberto himself was forced to work as a courier, trying to pay for his wife's cancer treatment without insurance. There was also Elena Kowalski, the owner of a small Polish company that produced specialized parts for the auto industry. Gwen convinced the parent company to set impossible terms, drove EU into bankruptcy, and then bought her equipment and client list for pennies. The pattern was always the same. Find vulnerable people who were doing important work, destroy their positions, take everything they built, and move on without even looking back. Gwen's entire career was built on the bones of small immigrant entrepreneurs who trusted the wrong person. So when I started looking for suppliers for Morrison, I looked beyond price and reliability. I specifically sought out people whose stories resembled those I found in Gwen's wake. People who had been crushed by corporations, but who still rose and rebuilt. People who knew what it was like to lose your life's work to someone who saw you as nothing more than a consumable. I found them everywhere. The textile company Akika. Her father lost everything in the 90s when an American distributor cheated him. Their family and ruined the contracts. The Petros firm. They were forced out of partnerships with a Western company, promised stability, and then disappeared along with their developments. Miguel Santos's business and his brothers were excluded from contracts for years, giving them to large white firms. Every supplier I worked with bore the scars of people like Gwen. And gradually, very carefully, I began to share stories with them. Not directly about my father, but about the schemes I saw again and again. I described how some managers acted, what to look out for, how to protect yourself from becoming a victim. I never mentioned Gwen by name or made direct accusations. I simply shared observations. By the 12th month, every contract I signed included special clauses, termination notices, penalty clauses, the right to jointly exit the deal. All of this looked reasonable and internationally standard from Morrison's perspective, especially given the supplier's experience. Gwen signed every contract, even without delving into the details, trusting my experience, and thinking only about reducing costs. In the first year, Morrison's profits grew by 38%, mainly because I found suppliers willing to work almost for nothing for the sake of a long-term partnership with an American firm that seemed to value their work. By the 15th month, I already had documents about everything. I had not only contracts and financial documents, but also personal stories behind each partnership. I received appeals from suppliers' families, where they shared their hopes, photographs of their enterprises, workers, communities, evidence that cooperation with Morrison really fed hundreds of families on 3 continents. I also had detailed reports on Gwen's working style, her attitude towards foreign partners, her disdain for those she considered unworthy, her ridicule of their outdated business methods. I collected correspondence in which she mocked the English of people who spoke 4 languages better than she did one. By the 18th month, my network was complete. All the key records of Morrison's supply chain depended on the relationships I'd built with people I'd once broken by leaders like Gwen. People who trusted me knew I saw them as people, not just profit centers. People who knew I'd never treat them the way corporate America had treated them. And then came that Tuesday morning when Gwen decided I'd had enough. I walked in her office, thinking it would be a routine quarterly report. Morrison had just announced record profits, largely thanks to the international partnerships I'd built. I expected praise, or at least talk of a raise. Instead, Gwen opened her computer and began explaining that the company would now work exclusively with American suppliers. "These foreign contracts are too complicated," she said, scrolling through the list of partners I'd spent months developing. Too many worries, too many cultural subtleties. We need suppliers who understand American business. I watch her cancel a Kicks $2 million a year contract. Disappeared. How he terminates the deal with the Petrovs, which we have been working on for a year and a half. How he breaks off cooperation with Miguel, whose details were important to the aerospace department. But, Gwen, I said carefully, these suppliers provide components that we can't find in the U.S. The Petrovs have packaging that the Americans simply don't know how to produce. Miguel has a precision machining that is superior to anything available here. She looked at me as if I was speaking a foreign language. Claire, you think like a relationship counselor, not a businesswoman. We don't need their sob stories about family business and traditions. We need deliveries on time and at a good price. There are plenty of companies in America that will give us all this without unnecessary emotions. This word of emotion hit me straight in the heart. It was the same phrase she had used 15 years earlier when she called my father's approach ineffective. The same cold intonation with which she destroyed step by step everyone who trusted her. And I realized that Gwen had learned nothing in all these years. No compassion, no wisdom, not even basic humanity. Sitting in front of me was the same woman who had once driven my father to his grave. Only now she had expensive suits and a bigger office. What about the penalty points? I asked quietly. Conditions for joint withdrawal from contracts. Gwen waved it off. Lawyers will sort out the paperwork. These people should be grateful that we gave them a whole year and a half of work. Most foreign suppliers never get these opportunities. She closed the last contract and turned to me with that same smug smile. Honestly, Claire, I think it will do you good. You're too emotionally involved in these partnerships. But in business, you can't worry about every personal story of a supplier. Success is results, not relationships. And then she said 7 words that changed everything. We don't need your foreign connections anymore. I nodded slowly, thanked her for the advice, and left the office. But I didn't go to the desk. I headed straight to the restroom, locked myself in a stall, and started making calls. The first one I called was Akika Tanik in Osaka. It was 3 a.m. for her, but she answered on the second ring, thinking something urgent had happened. And in a sense, it was. And Kika is Claire from Morrison. I need you to listen to me very carefully. And then made a few calls myself. Within 6 hours, every supplier I had worked with for a year and a half received the same message. And not from me directly, but from each other. The network I've been building all this time wasn't just about business. It was about trust, mutual protection, and knowing when to work together. Akika called the Petrovs in Bulgaria. The Petrovs contacted Miguel in Mexico City. Miguel recruited chip manufacturers in Taiwan. Taiwanese have contacted packaging companies in Vietnam. Everything went in a chain, like dominoes in the opposite direction. Each call led to 3 more, until suppliers from 12 countries simultaneously reviewed their contracts with Morrison and discovered something interesting. All contracts had the same condition of joint exit. This seemed like a simple legal protection, but in reality, it meant that if a company terminated a contract with even one international partner without cause, the others could leave immediately and without penalties. By Thursday morning, Morrison's production lines were quiet. Not because of a strike or equipment breakdown. Simply 68% of key components stopped coming in, including high-precision parts from Miguel's workshop, without which the aerospace department could not function. Special polymers from Vietnam, without which it was impossible to produce auto parts. Textile components from AKIK are important for defense contracts. I sat at my desk and watched as managers began to panic at 10 a.m. They called suppliers, and they politely replied that they were exercising their right to withdraw from contracts. By midday, production managers had already gathered for emergency meetings, trying to figure out how Morrison had become so dependent on international partners that Gwen had said they no longer needed. Gwen spent all of Thursday in crisis management mode, calling American firms. But they quoted prices 3 times higher and promised deliveries only in the next quarter. Some could offer replacement of some parts, but they had never even heard of other materials. On Friday morning, Gwen came out to the operations teams and cheerfully announced, "This is only a temporary adjustment. We're switching to reliable local suppliers that better align with our strategy. But by Friday afternoon, a major defense contractor called, expecting delivery of special components the following week. He expressed serious concerns about delays. Immediately after this, the automaker, which depended on our parts, began asking questions about other suppliers. All that week, I recorded everything that happened. It wasn't just the chaos in production, but also Gwen's reaction, her dismissive comments about suppliers being overly dramatic, her conviction that foreign partners were unreliable and that the company would only be better off without them. Her complete lack of understanding as to why a 68% supply chain disruption at once caused a catastrophe. But the real story came Monday morning when CEO Harrison called an emergency management meeting. I wasn't usually invited to such meetings, but this time he specifically asked me to come because I was the only one who knew Morrison's entire international supply chain. Gwen looked genuinely surprised to see me. She probably thought that I would be the one blamed, not her. Harrison opened the meeting with a simple question. Who can explain how we went from record profits to a complete production shutdown in just 4 days? Gwen immediately turned on the presentation. She spoke about supply diversification, a new strategy, and the benefits of working with American partners. The slides featured graphs and forecasts that made it look like abandoning international contracts was a wise decision. What we are experiencing now, she confidently concluded, is a natural stage of transition from too much dependence to a more sustainable system. Harrison listened to her calmly, then turned to me. Claire, you're the one who made all these connections. Help me understand what really happened. Harrison asked. This was the moment I had been preparing for all this time, without even realizing it. I opened my laptop and turned on the presentation I had been making since Tuesday. It showed the real history of our international partnerships. Mr. Harrison, I said, with your permission, I would like to show you who exactly our overseas suppliers are and what it really means to work with them. The first slide shows the Akikataneki factory in Osaka. There were not only production figures, but also photos of her family, her grandfather's workshop, old equipment, 3 generations of workers who made parts for our defense contracts. I explained that Akika had restructured the entire production to suit Morrison's needs, hired 12 new employees, bought new machines, all for the sake of partnership with us. Second slide, the Prova family. Elena Petrova's husband lost his job as an engineer during the crisis in Bulgaria. Their packaging company became the family's chance to survive. Contracts with Morrison allowed them to open a new production facility and provide jobs for 40 people in their village. Third slide, Miguel Santos and his precision instrument workshop. I showed him a photo of his 3 daughters who were studying to be engineers and dream of working in the family business, which has grown thanks to aerospace contracts. Miguel worked 16 hours a day to meet our standards and made equipment that no one in the U.S. could offer at the same price and quality. Slide after slide, I showed Harrison the people when simply called foreign connections. I showed them their workshops, quality certificates, and stories of workers whose families lived on the money from Morrison orders. I explained that these weren't just suppliers. These were specific people who put everything they had into our partnership, and they gave us something that couldn't be replaced within the country. Akika's textiles are based on unique techniques developed by her grandfather. The packaging of the product has chemical properties, which American manufacturers cannot replicate. The precision of Miguel's instruments is the result of 20 years of work and experience. Then I showed the financial consequences, not just the production delays, but the long-term losses from the loss of relationships that have been built over decades. These contracts brought Morrison $47 million a year, and the companies themselves grew by an average of 18% annually thanks to their collaboration with us. Mr. Harrison, I concluded, this partnership couldn't simply be written off as an expense. These suppliers were our real advantage. Our competitors in the U.S. did not have access to them. We got better quality for less money because they trusted Morrison and valued our orders above even better offers from other companies. I watched Gwen's face during the presentation. At first she was puzzled. Then her face became increasingly worried when Harrison asked direct questions. Why didn't you discuss with the operations department the termination of contracts with key suppliers? Why didn't you offer a transition period, but cut everything off right away? Why didn't you check the collective waiver clauses before starting this process? The real turning point came when I showed Harrison the last part of the presentation, a document about how these same suppliers had previously worked with other American companies. The picture was the same. They were promised long-term relationships. They delivered excellent results, and then they were abandoned for optimization. But they continued to work with Morrison, I said, because we believed that we were different. Because I spent 18 months proving to them that we value their work and understand their worth. Harrison was silent for a long time, studying the figures and supplier profiles. Then he looked at Gwen in a way I had never seen before. Not with anger, but with deepest disappointment. Gwen, explain to me what the strategy was in cutting off $47 million in annual revenue without consulting with operations, finance, and management. Gwen started talking about internal procurement and simple logistics again, but she no longer had confidence. She kept repeating words like these people and cultural complexities, but after my presentation, it sounded worse and worse. What cultural difficulties? Harrison asked. According to Claire's documents, these suppliers always met standards, quality standards, and deadlines. Well, the language barrier, the time difference, the constant need to maintain relationships, Gwen said with increasing tension. Foreigners require too much fussing, unlike local partners who know American business rules. And then Harrison asked the question that changed everything. Gwen, have you even read the right of withdrawal clauses in these contracts? There was a long, heavy silence, because according to Claire's documents, every international supplier had the right to leave immediately if we terminated contracts with other foreign partners without cause. Did you understand that canceling one contract automatically triggers the departure of all the others? Silence again. Gwen's face grew paler. She realized that Harrison was asking non-rhetorical questions. Mr. Harrison, she began cautiously. I trusted the lawyers, Gwen said. These clauses on the right of withdrawal seemed like ordinary formal phrases for protection. Formal phrases, Harrison repeated slowly. Gwen, these clauses exist precisely to ensure that companies don't treat foreign suppliers as expendable commodities. They're needed to ensure that agreements are honored, not canceled at the whim of management. I could see Gwen realizing she'd trapped herself. Not because I caught her, but because her disregard for her foreign partners had blinded her. She hadn't even noticed what she'd agreed to in the contracts I'd spent so long negotiating. Claire, Harrison said, turning to me, do you think there's a chance to restore these partnerships? This was my moment. I've been waiting for it for a long time. Now I could tell the truth, which would change everything for Gwen, without revealing my personal motives. Mr. Harrison, on Friday, I contacted our former suppliers to discuss the possibility of reconciliation. Unfortunately, their response was the same. They are willing to consider working together again, but only on one condition. What condition? They require a written guarantee that Gwen Hollister will no longer have anything to do with international contracts. A dead silence fell in the room. Gwen stared at me as if I'd struck her. What? She whispered. I'm sorry, Gwen, but I have to be honest with them, I replied. Many of the suppliers have said outright that they felt disrespected in their dealings with you. They mentioned your comments about their English, your dismissive attitude toward their working methods, and what they perceived as cultural insensitivity. I opened my laptop again, and I showed Harrison official letters from suppliers. These were not transcripts of private conversations, but their formal written responses to my inquiries. Akikatanika's letter was particularly hard-hitting. Ms. Hollister's approach to international partnerships demonstrates a lack of understanding of the principle of mutual respect. Her comments about foreign difficulties and simplified logistics create the impression that Morrison views international suppliers as a problem, not an asset. Miguel Santos wrote even more bluntly, "We value Claire's professionalism, but we cannot risk investments if the company's management considers our contribution to be something insignificant." Ms. Hollister's decision to terminate contracts demonstrates a systematic disregard for obligations to international partners. I read one opinion after another. Suppliers from 3 continents wrote the same thing. They do not trust Morrison as long as someone with an attitude like Gwen's is in management. These are not personal attacks, I told Harrison. These are business decisions based on real facts and repeated behavior. Foreign suppliers can't afford to work with companies that can drop them at any moment without cause. Harrison spent another hour studying supplier documents, contract terms, and financial forecasts. He asked many precise questions. Was it possible to restore relations? What alternatives were available among local suppliers? What was the transition time frame? All this time, Gwen sat silently and looked increasingly uncomfortable. It finally dawned on her. How much had she miscalculated? Finally, Harrison closed the laptop and looked straight at her. I need time to discuss the situation with the board of directors. Claire, prepare for me a complete set of documents on international partners and all their comments on the possible restoration of cooperation. Of course, Mr. Harrison. And you, Gwen, compile a detailed report explaining why you made the decision to terminate the contracts and provide an assessment of alternatives among local suppliers. After the meeting, Gwen caught up with me at the elevator. Her calm appearance cracked. Claire, what exactly did you tell these suppliers about me? I looked at her calmly. I told the truth, Gwen. I conveyed to them what you said about us no longer needing foreign connections. But that's not what I meant, she began, and then fell silent. What exactly didn't you mean? I asked. That international partnerships are unimportant to you? That cultural sensitivity is superfluous? That managing relationships is an emotional luxury we can't afford? Gwen looked at me and only then seemed to realize that her phrases had been recorded and passed on to the very people she had called foreign problems. Those suppliers trusted Morrison because they trusted me, I continued. When you tore up their contracts and called their work foreign complications, you destroyed the relationship I spent 18 months building. They're not angry, Gwen. They're simply protecting themselves from the kind of treatment you gave them. The elevator arrived. I stepped inside as the doors were closing and said the phrase I'd been waiting 15 years to say. Sometimes the people considered superfluous turn out to be the ones holding it all together. 3 weeks later, Harrison announced a restructuring of the purchasing department. When Hollister was transferred to the customer service department, where her home experience was more useful. And I was appointed director of international supplier relations with full authority to restore the partnerships the company had lost. It took 6 months to restore it, not because the suppliers were angry, but because they needed proof. Morrison really did learn its lesson. They needed written guarantees, a control system, and mandatory cultural sensitivity training for management. Gwen lasted 8 months in customer service and then left for a smaller company. According to people who know her, she now answers calls from angry customers in a regional center and listens every day to complaints about corporate rules that no one can change. I never told anyone about my father, never said why I chose Morrison and why I spent a year and a half building relationships with suppliers similar to the people Gwen had once destroyed. My retribution wasn't about dragging her past out into the open. I simply gave her to feel the consequences of her own decisions. Every supplier who left Morrison did so because Gwen treated them as unnecessary. We lost every partnership simply because she prioritized control and mistrust. All the company's losses were the result of her words and her inability to see international partners as people worthy of respect. The best part wasn't that Gwen lost a high-ranking position or suffered during calls with clients. The main thing was that she finally understood what my father felt in the last months of his life. Powerlessness, when everything you've built collapses just because someone more powerful decided you're no longer needed. If you listen to this story to the end and understand why I spent a year and a half preparing such a complex plan, subscribe to my channel and like it, because there are still many such Gwenhalist leaders in the world who think that people are easily replaceable. And there are many more stories about what happens when they underestimate the power of patience, preparation, and trust. Those who the authorities consider them invisible, but in reality, they see everything and remember it longer than they think.